The company you've never used, but that quietly shapes the world. Most technology companies fight for your attention. They want you scrolling, clicking, reacting. Their success is measured in minutes, impressions, and dopamine loops. Palantir doesn't want any of that. In fact, Palantir doesn't want you at all. You will never download Palantir. You will never open it on your phone. You will never agree to its terms of service. And yet, Palantir influences decisions that affect borders, wars, supply chains, healthcare systems, immigration enforcement, and corporate layoffs. It lives entirely outside the consumer internet. No ads, no public demos, no freemium tiers. That's what makes it different and unsettling. Palantir operates in environments where uncertainty is expensive, where decisions must be made with incomplete information, where being wrong means lives lost, money wasted, or strategic advantage surrendered. In those environments, the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's clarity. Palantir doesn't promise truth, it promises coherence. It takes messy, contradictory, siloed data and turns it into something decision makers can act on, not slowly, not academically, but operationally. This is why Palantir feels less like a tech company and more like infrastructure. You don't argue with infrastructure, you rely on it. You only notice it when it fails, and when it does, no one is quite sure who's accountable. That invisibility isn't a side effect, it's the design. And to understand why Palantir was built this way, you have to go back to a moment when the world realized that having information isn't the same as understanding it. September 11th, 2001 didn't just shatter buildings, it shattered confidence in modern intelligence systems. In the aftermath, investigations revealed something deeply uncomfortable. The data existed. Names appeared in reports. Travel patterns were logged. Financial transactions raised flags. Different agencies each had pieces of the puzzle, but no one saw the picture. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was fragmentation. Agencies were siloed. Databases didn't talk to each other. Analysts were drowning in information but starving for context. The system was optimized for collection, not comprehension. After 9/11, intelligence agencies stopped asking who messed up and started asking a far scarier question. What if humans are fundamentally bad at connecting complex data at scale? This question is where Palantir was born. Peter Thiel, a PayPal co-founder, had already seen algorithms outperform humans at detecting fraud. PayPal didn't stop fraud by hiring more people. It stopped fraud by letting software notice patterns humans couldn't. Thiel's logic was brutally simple. If algorithms can detect a stolen credit card in milliseconds, why can't they detect coordinated terror networks? That idea attracted an unusual partner. In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital arm. Their mandate wasn't to make money. It was to ensure the intelligence community never suffered another catastrophic blind spot. Palantir wasn't asked to build an app. It was asked to build a new way of seeing reality. Palantir operates in environments where uncertainty is expensive, where decisions must be made with incomplete information, where being wrong means lives lost, money wasted, or strategic advantage surrendered. In those environments, the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's clarity. Palantir doesn't promise truth, it promises coherence. It takes messy, contradictory, siloed data and turns it into something decision makers can act on. Not slowly, not academically, but operationally. This is why Palantir feels less like a tech company and more like infrastructure. You don't argue with infrastructure, you rely on it. You only notice it when it fails. And when it does, no one is quite sure who's accountable. That invisibility isn't a side effect, it's the design. And to understand why Palantir was built this way, you have to go back to a moment when the world realized that having information isn't the same as understanding it. Early Palantir wasn't pretty. It wasn't intuitive, it wasn't friendly. Users often complained it felt like piloting a spacecraft just to answer simple questions. But the power was undeniable. Palantir didn't treat data as rows and columns. It treated data as relationships. People weren't just records, they were nodes. Events weren't isolated, they were chains. The software let analysts explore reality the way humans naturally think, through stories. Who met whom? Who paid whom? What happened before this event? What changed after? This was radical. Intelligence work had always been linear. Palantir made it multidimensional. Instead of asking, what does this data say? Analysts asked, what does this data imply? But that power made institutions nervous. If one analyst could suddenly see everything, what did that say about hierarchy, about authority, about past failures? Agencies resisted, bureaucrats stalled. Palantir didn't simplify or compromise, it waited. Eventually, reality forced adoption. Palantir operates in environments where uncertainty is expensive, where decisions must be made with incomplete information, where being wrong means lives lost, money wasted, or strategic advantage surrendered. In those environments, the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's clarity. Palantir doesn't promise truth, it promises coherence. It takes messy, contradictory, siloed data and turns it into something decision makers can act on. Not slowly, not academically, but operationally. This is why Palantir feels less like a tech company and more like infrastructure. You don't argue with infrastructure, you rely on it. You only notice it when it fails. And when it does, no one is quite sure who's accountable. That invisibility isn't a side effect, it's the design. And to understand why Palantir was built this way, you have to go back to a moment when the world realized that having information isn't the same as understanding it. By the mid 2000s, the US military was overwhelmed by data. Iraq and Afghanistan generated endless intelligence, patrol reports, intercepted calls, drone footage, IED incidents. Information existed everywhere, but insight arrived too late. Palantir's Gotham software changed that. For the first time, intelligence became operational in real time. And IED wasn't just an explosion, it was part of a system. The phone used, the money trail, the safe house, the meeting place. Commanders could see entire networks, not isolated threats. Special forces didn't adopt Gotham because they were told to. They adopted it because it worked. That's rare in military technology. Washington didn't like Palantir. It didn't follow procurement rituals. It didn't hire retired generals. When blocked, Palantir sued the US Army and won. That lawsuit forced a reckoning. Innovation could no longer be ignored simply because it came from outsiders. Palantir wasn't just supporting wars. By the mid 2000s, the United States military wasn't losing wars because of a lack of firepower. It was losing clarity. Iraq and Afghanistan had become data factories. Every patrol produced reports. Every checkpoint logged IDs. Every drone flight generated hours of footage. Intelligence wasn't scarce. It was overwhelming. Commanders were buried under thousands of spreadsheets, PDFs, radio logs, and emails, all arriving too late and in the wrong format. This is where Palantir Technologies stopped being an experiment and started becoming indispensable. Palantir's Gotham platform entered war zones not as a replacement for analysts, but as an amplifier of them. Instead of treating incidents as isolated events, Gotham treated them as symptoms of systems. An IED explosion wasn't just a bomb, it was the visible output of a supply chain. Someone financed it, someone bought the phone, someone scouted the road, someone planted the device, someone disappeared afterward. Palantir made those invisible connections visible. For the first time, intelligence wasn't just retrospective, it was predictive. Analysts could trace patterns across time and geography, watching how small changes, like a new safe house or a new courier, rippled through a network. What used to take weeks of manual correlation could now be done in hours, sometimes minutes. And the interface mattered. Gotham didn't look like traditional military software. It looked closer to Google Maps, intuitive, visual, navigable. That alone changed behavior. Analysts actually used it. Special forces trusted it. Commanders asked for it by name. In a system where most software is tolerated at best, that was revolutionary. But success on the battlefield didn't translate to acceptance in Washington. Palantir didn't play the defense contractor game. It didn't hire retired generals. It didn't sponsor conferences. It didn't cultivate procurement relationships. To the Pentagon establishment, Palantir was an outsider, young, opinionated, and unwilling to follow ritual. So when the army tried to award a massive intelligence contract to a legacy contractor without open competition, Palantir did something almost unthinkable for a Silicon Valley company. It sued the US government. And it won. A federal judge ruled that the army had violated procurement law by refusing to even evaluate Palantir's software, despite the fact that soldiers were already using it in active combat zones. The ruling sent a shockwave through military procurement. Innovation could no longer be ignored just because it didn't come from the usual players. From that moment on, Palantir was no longer just a helpful tool, it was a precedent. The wars proved something uncomfortable. Modern conflict wasn't just about weapons or soldiers, it was about information advantage, and Palantir had quietly become the system that turned chaos into actionable understanding. In war zones, results matter more than politics. Palantir delivered results, and once lives are saved because of a system, removing that system becomes almost impossible. This was the moment Palantir crossed a line from startup to strategic asset. It was reshaping how wars were understood. When the battlefield came home, technology never stays where it's born, especially technology that works. Once Palantir proved it could untangle insurgent networks overseas, domestic agencies began asking an obvious question. What if we use this here? Terrorism wasn't only foreign, threats weren't only external, and data was everywhere. Immigration enforcement signed on first, then border security, then law enforcement. The same logic that once tracked bomb makers now mapped human relationships inside the United States. Who lives with who talks to who sends money where, who shows up near a flag location more than once. This is where Palantir's image fractured. To its defenders, the software was neutral, just math, just connections, just probability. To critics, it felt like surveillance with a user interface. Civil liberties groups warned of algorithmic guilt, where association became suspicion and proximity became risk. Inside Palantir, the tension became personal. Engineers who joined to stop terrorists began asking whether they were now helping automate enforcement against civilians. Internal letters circulated. Some employees resigned publicly. Protests followed contracts. Palantir's leadership never changed its position. We don't decide who is targeted, we provide tools. But tools change behavior. When a system highlights certain patterns, humans start trusting those patterns. When recommendations save time, they start replacing judgment. Over time, decision makers stop asking why and start asking how fast. This is the uncomfortable truth. Palantir didn't need to order anyone to do anything. It simply shaped what looked important. At scale, that influence becomes power. By this point, Palantir was no longer just a counterterrorism platform. It had become a general purpose system for identifying, ranking, and acting on human risk. And the question shifted from can we use this to can we afford not to? The corporate pivot when power went private. Governments move slowly, corporations don't. For years, Palantir claimed it wasn't interested in commercial clients. They framed themselves as principled, different from Silicon Valley. No ads, no consumer data, no surveillance capitalism. That stance changed quietly. The result was Foundry. Foundry took the same engine used in war zones and applied it to corporations. Instead of insurgents, it tracked supply chains. Instead of safe houses, factories. Instead of couriers, employees and vendors. The pitch was irresistible. Give us all your data and we'll tell you what to do. Not dashboards, not reports, decisions. Cut production here, increase inventory there, close this plant, delay that shipment. During COVID, Foundry spread everywhere. Hospitals used it to manage capacity. Governments used it to distribute vaccines. Airlines used it to survive. Supply chains ran on it. Most people never noticed. That's the point. Executives loved Foundry because it reduced uncertainty. But something subtle happened in the process. Decision making moved from human deliberation to system trust. If the platform worked yesterday, why question it today? Foundry didn't explain the world, it optimized it. And optimization has a bias: efficiency over empathy, speed over reflection. Palantir wasn't selling understanding, it was selling confidence under pressure. An IPO that refused to explain itself. When Palantir finally went public, it didn't celebrate like other tech companies. No flashy roadshow, no charismatic pitch about changing the world. Just a quiet, direct listing. Investors didn't know what to make of it. Revenue growth was slow, margins were strange. Government contracts dominated, profitability lagged. By Silicon Valley standards, it looked mediocre. And yet, demand persisted. Because Palantir wasn't being valued as software, it was being valued as position. Once Palantir embeds itself inside an institution, removal becomes painful. Processes adapt. People rely on it. Alternatives feel risky. The switching cost isn't technical, it's psychological and operational. Investors weren't buying a SaaS multiple, they were buying embedded power. Palantir didn't need explosive growth, it needed permanence. And permanence is rare. The endgame, when institutions forget how to think alone. Today, Palantir sits behind war rooms, logistics systems, intelligence dashboards, and crisis centers around the world. It doesn't command armies, it doesn't pass laws, it doesn't arrest anyone. It informs those who do. That's more powerful. In Ukraine, Palantir helps map supply lines and predict battlefield movement. In governments, it supports strategic planning. In corporations, it drives restructuring and allocation. It is increasingly the layer between reality and decision. The danger isn't that Palantir is evil. The danger is that it becomes indispensable. When institutions rely on systems to interpret the world, they slowly lose the ability to interpret it themselves. Judgment atrophies. Responsibility blurs. Outcomes are owned, but processes aren't. If something goes wrong, who is accountable? The algorithm? The operator? The institution? Palantir insists it only provides tools. History suggests tools that shape power are never neutral. Palantir isn't the future of consumer tech. It's the future of institutional cognition. And the most unsettling truth isn't what it can see. It's what happens when the people in charge stop seeing without it. Eventually, reality forced adoption. Palantir operates in environments where uncertainty is expensive, where decisions must be made with incomplete information, where being wrong means lives lost, money wasted, or strategic advantage surrendered. In those environments, the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's clarity. Palantir doesn't promise truth, it promises coherence. It takes messy, contradictory, siloed data and turns it into something decision makers can act on. Not slowly, not academically, but operationally. This is why Palantir feels less like a tech company and more like infrastructure. You don't argue with infrastructure, you rely on it. You only notice it when it fails. And when it does, no one is quite sure who's accountable. That invisibility isn't a side effect, it's the design. And to understand why Palantir was built this way, you have to go back to a moment when the world realized that having information isn't the same as understanding it. Eventually, reality forced adoption. Palantir operates in environments where uncertainty is expensive, where decisions must be made with incomplete information, where being wrong means lives lost, money wasted, or strategic advantage surrendered. In those environments, the most valuable commodity isn't data, it's clarity. Palantir doesn't promise truth, it promises coherence. It takes messy, contradictory, siloed data and turns it into something decision makers can act on. Not slowly, not academically, but operationally. This is why Palantir feels less like a tech company and more like infrastructure. You don't argue with infrastructure, you rely on it. You only notice it when it fails. And when it does, no one is quite sure who's accountable. That invisibility isn't a side effect, it's the design. And to understand why Palantir was built this way, you have to go back to a moment when the world realized that having information isn't the same as understanding it. Governments are slow, corporations aren't. So Palantir built Foundry. Foundry did for enterprises what Gotham did for intelligence agencies. It unified data across departments and turned it into actionable decisions, not recommendations, decisions. During COVID, Foundry quietly ran logistics behind vaccine distribution, hospitals, airlines, and supply chains. While the public argued, Palantir optimized. Executives loved it because it removed uncertainty. But Foundry introduced a new problem: opacity. Decisions worked, but few understood why. Palantir wasn't selling understanding, it was selling outcomes. Today, Palantir sits behind war rooms, logistics systems, and crisis dashboards worldwide. It doesn't rule, it informs those who do. That's more powerful. Palantir isn't the future of consumer tech, it's the future of institutional cognition. And the most unsettling truth: once systems learn to think for institutions, institutions slowly forget how to think without them. That's not dystopia, that's already happening.